Welcome to my channel. I'm Gary Wiryawan, and today I want to talk about how to improve your travel photography pictures using Strobist technique. Let's go! Before we continue with the video, this is just a quick reminder for you to support my channel by liking this video, by sharing this video, and subscribing to my channel down below. Let's continue with the video. So today I want to talk a little bit about how to improve your travel photography pictures using the Strobist technique. Strobist photography is actually a photography technique where you use an off-camera flash to shoot your subject. With this technique, you'll be able to balance the exposure of both the subject and the background. You will also get more control of both exposure individually. Basically, you will take a picture of a subject using a flash, but instead of using the flash on camera or using the built-in flash of your camera, you will take it off from your camera and shoot it like this. You will fire your flash off camera using either a wireless system like this or using a cable. So instead of firing your flash directly from the front of your subject, you will angle your flash so that it mimics the direction of a sunlight, which will of course make the light looks more natural. The result is a perfectly exposed subject and background that doesn't look amateurish at all, because the light from the flash is more controlled due to the angle and some other factors that I will explain. If you want to learn more about Strobist technique, you can go to strobist.com, where photographer David Hoppy explained in depth everything about Strobist that you need to know. I'm personally a huge fan of Strobist technique, and I have been trying to incorporate as many Strobist technique as I can into a lot of my photography. Now you might ask, why do you need to shoot with the Strobist technique? Why don't you just shoot natural light instead? I personally prefer to shoot natural light all the time, but there are times when Strobist technique could really help to elevate your photography. So here's a short story as an example. So let's say you're having a vacation and you're traveling to a beautiful country like New Zealand or Switzerland during spring, which is beautiful. There are lots of beautiful mountains, the sky is clear, it's blue, there are lots of green trees, and there's a lot of sceneries that beg to be photographed. Now you want to capture that scenery with your wife or your daughter or with your friend or your significant others, and you're imagining a perfect shot of your wife or your daughter with the great scenery behind the subject. Now as you're about to take the picture, everything that happens in your eyes tells you that the scenery and the subject blends very well. It's so perfect, so beautiful. And at this point, you start taking pictures of your wife or your daughter. Now there's just one small problem. The sun is right behind her and it's backlight situation. Now you try to compensate by increasing the exposure so that you can perfectly expose your wife or your daughter. But then the sky turns very bright and blown out. But if you're not increasing your exposure, then your wife or your daughter turns into silhouette. Now you don't have a lot of choices right here. You have to do either one, and you're switching to RAW, and you took that picture anyway. A few days later, you come back home from the vacation and you start importing the pictures to your computer and you start editing them. Now you come across that picture again, the one that's backlight, and you start editing like crazy. You increase the shadow, you drop the highlight, everything you try to do, but nothing seems to work. Now that sounds tiring, right? Now that's when the Strobist technique comes in. Now imagine the same situation again. Your wife or your daughter with a beautiful scenery behind her and a backlight situation, but this time you're bringing a flash with a wireless system. You then proceed to take the picture with the Strobist technique. Snap! And just like that, you got that perfect picture. A picture with the perfect exposure balance of your subject and your scenery. All is perfect, just like what your eye sees. Excellent! You sacrifice a little bit of weight to carry this rig, but in the end, you save a lot of time, because later when you edit the picture, you don't have to edit drastically to get that perfect exposure that you need. So that's one example of a story when a Strobist technique could really help to save an image that's almost unusable when you don't use a Strobist technique. Now you don't have to do this technique every time you take a picture, because when the sun is coming from the right angle, then you don't really need to improve it with Strobist technique. So you use it only when you're in backlight situation or if you want to add some artistic look to your image. Now in this video, I want to talk about how to incorporate the Strobist technique into travel photography, because Strobist technique is actually the perfect technique to use in environmental portrait, which is actually the kind of picture that you will take during a family vacation. Just to make sure we're on the same page, environmental portrait is actually a portrait photography with the beautiful scenery behind the subject acting as a background. Now we're talking about travel, so there are two big limitations when it comes to travel. One is size and two is weight. Now the problem with travel photography is that bringing your gear, you cannot bring everything that you have in your home. You cannot bring all the cameras and lenses that you have. You can only bring a few that you really need. So the same goes with your Strobist gear. You cannot just bring anything that you have, so we have to compromise carefully. Essentially, with your Strobist gear, all that you need is just the flash and the wireless system or the cable that you need to make the off-camera flash work. With this setup, you'll create a flash that will produce a hard light, something that's not too flattering to be honest, but if you're careful with the placement and the adjustment of your flash, you'll be able to mimic the sun's light that looks very natural on your subject. Optionally, if you're able to bring more when you travel, then you can bring a soft light modifier like this Rogue Flash Bender to get a softer light on your subject. But rather than carrying this soft light modifier, I personally prefer to carry this instead. This is a selfie stick that has a tripod base on it, and I will attach it to my flash so that I can better position and aim my flash towards my subject. With that said, I'm going to show you now all the gears that I use for Strobist travel photography. So for the camera, I'm using this Panasonic GX8 with a 12 to 35mm f2.8 lens as my main lens for Strobist photography during travel. I will also use this camera that's recording me right now, the Panasonic G85, with my favorite wide angle lens, the Laowa 7.5mm f2, as my main camera also for Strobist travel photography. My favorite flash for Strobist travel photography is actually a small flash called Viltrox JY610II. This flash is very small, very lightweight, and it has full manual control. You might have noticed in my flash that I have this orange gel called CTO, which will help this flash to emulate the golden hour light. For the wireless trigger, I'm using a pair of Yongnuo RF603C Mark II so that I can use my flash off camera. So each one of these guys can act as both the transmitter and the receiver, so I can put either one on the camera or on the flash. For the grip of the flash, I'm using this Benro selfie stick, which is called MK10. This stick acts as both as an extension for my flash as well as for a light stand with the tripod on the base of this stick. And these are all of the gears that I need for the Strobist travel photography. Now let's get on with the actual technique of shooting Strobist photography during travel. Basically, you want to shoot all manual because you want to be able to adjust all the settings that you need for Strobist photography. For flash photography, especially with Strobist, there are four main settings that you need to be able to have a full control. One is the flash power, two is the shutter speed, 3 is the aperture, and last but not least, ISO. Now let's talk about flash power first. Flash power is very self-explanatory, so it's basically how bright the flash is when it's fired. The more powerful it is, the brighter your subject is going to be, vice versa. That being said, I'm suggesting to you to get a flash with full manual control like these guys. You don't really need to use any of the advanced automatic feature like the TTL or high-speed sync. All you need to do is just the ease of use to change the manual power control. Next, let's talk about shutter speed. In regular photography, you are suggested to use shutter speed that is as fast as possible. However, when you're shooting with flash or like in this example Strobist photography, you have to obey the maximum sync speed of your camera. So make sure that you know the maximum sync speed of your exact camera. Mine is about 1/250th of a second. What that means is I have to shoot under 1/250th of a second for the camera to register the flash. Anything faster than that, then the flash will no longer affect the image. Now you are left with ISO and aperture, which are pretty self-explanatory. You control the aperture to get both the depth of field and the exposure that you need, and you control the ISO to get just the exposure that you need. Now let's actually talk about how to make a Strobist environmental portrait for your travel photography. To do that, I'm going to show you a clip of an actual Strobist photography session of my fiancé during my recent travel. So today, I'm accompanied by my fiancée Nora, who will act as today's model. First, I will start by finding the scenery that I like. I will compose the frame and pose my subject, and I will shoot without the flash just to get an idea of how the composition will work. I'll keep in my mind a few things such as the sun position if you're shooting during a bright sunny daylight, and then I will adjust the frame accordingly. Next, I will start to shoot in full manual mode, and slowly I will incorporate the Strobist technique. To do that, I actually have a sequence of how I actually set the settings for Strobist photography. First, I will set the ISO depending on the scenery that I shoot. If I'm shooting in dark environment, then I will use high ISO. If I'm shooting in bright environment, I will use lower ISO. Next, I will set the shutter speed first. If I'm shooting in a bright sunny environment like what I'm doing in the video, then I will set my shutter speed to the maximum sync speed of my camera, about 1/250th of a second. However, if it's dark or if I'm shooting during night, then I will shoot at lower shutter speed without creating motion blur, such as about 1/60th of a second or lower if I can. Now that you got both the shutter speed and the ISO, all you need to do now is to set the aperture first. Basically, all you need to do is just adjust your aperture as needed so that you can get the perfect exposure of EV0 in your camera metering. If it's bright, then usually I'll be shooting at ISO 200, 1/250th of a second shutter speed, and about f8 or f11 with my aperture. Now, without touching the flash power, you already covered ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. Now you get the exposure of the ambient, and now you can adjust the ambient to your liking if you want slightly underexposed, which is sometimes what I like, or you just want perfectly normal EV0 ambient surrounding exposure. However, if you don't want your flash to look a little bit too obvious in your picture, then obviously you can increase the exposure of the ambient just by a little bit so that it can hide a little bit of the flash effect. At this point, you can start to ask your subject to come into the frame and pose. If you take the picture, the scenery will look good, but your subject will be underexposed. This is actually what you want. And to fix the underexposed subject, now it's time to introduce the flash. First step is to turn on the wireless system on both the camera and the flash. If you are using cable instead, connect one to the camera and one to the flash. Now position the flash to about 80 degrees from the left or 80 degrees from the right, and aim the head of the flash to the subject. Basically, by positioning your flash from the side of the subject will emulate the sunlight that usually coming from the side of the subject. The more you aim the flash to the side of the subject, the more dramatic the result will be, because you will create more dramatic shadow and highlight on your subject. Usually, I'd like to counter the sunlight effect by positioning the flash against the direction of the sunlight. This will create a butterfly lighting effect if the sun is not behind the subject. But if the sun is directly behind the subject in a backlight situation, then it doesn't really matter if you place it on the left or the right of the subject. All you need to do is just to experiment with the best flash position for your subject. Now, if you're shooting in a bright sunny condition, then I will start with 1/4 of flash power. If it's too bright, then you can definitely reduce to 1/8, 1/16 and so on. But if it's too weak, then you can increase to half power or full power. If it's dark and you're shooting at very high ISO, then you can use as low power as possible on your flash, like 1/64 or 1/32. Now do some test shots and adjust all the settings accordingly if you find that the result is not yet satisfying. Also, don't forget to experiment with the position of the flash until you get the most satisfying result on your subject. Congratulations, you're now able to use the Strobist technique on your environmental portrait during travel. Excellent! Hopefully with this technique, you'll be able to get a picture that's perfectly balanced in terms of exposure of your subject and with the scenery. Now, before I end the video, there are 4 important rules that you need to remember regarding the exposure setting of Strobist photography. 1. The flash power will only affect the exposure of the subject that's being flashed on. 2. The ISO will affect both the flash subject and the ambient exposure. 3. The aperture will affect also both the subject and the ambient, and it will also affect the depth of field. Last but not least, number 4, the shutter speed will only affect the ambient exposure. Keep these rules in mind so that if you are shooting and you need to change any of the settings, you already know what each will do to the final image. Experiment with the exposure combination, the lighting angle, the sun direction, and so many other things that you can experiment with until you get the result that you like. So that is all for today's video. I hope you liked this video and you found this video to be useful. Please comment down below if you have any question about strobist photography during traveling, and I'll be happy to answer any of the questions that you might have. Also, don't forget to support my channel by liking this video, by sharing this video, and subscribing to my channel down below. Thank you and goodbye.